Modern India, a fascinating mix of old traditions, modern technology, conspicuous wealth, and abysmal poverty, didn't just happen. Next on Global Perspectives, a discussion of the intellectual underpinnings of the world's largest democracy.
This program is made possible, in part, by funding from the UCF Global Perspectives Office, the Global Connections Foundation, and the India Center at UCF.
This is Global Perspectives with Pulitzer Prize-winning commentator John Bercia.
Welcome to Global Perspectives. For most Americans, our image of India is shaped by current events. We see stories of the crowded cities and of people just scraping by, or we see images of people who have struck it rich in their growing economy. We picture factories making products for the world, offering jobs that used to be American. Occasionally we see political leaders trying to handle a society beset by ethnic differences, free speech issues, and daunting infrastructure needs. Today, we are going beyond that. Our guest, author and scholar Ananya Vajpeyi, will talk to us about the 2,500 years of knowledge and tradition that underpin India's own brand of democracy. Welcome to the show, Ananya.
Thank you.
Your book, Righteous Republic, in many ways is an odyssey, but you've had a personal odyssey that you went through before writing the book. Tell us a little bit about your life and how you got to the point of writing this interesting manuscript about leadership in India.
I was educated in India right through college and was studying English literature. And as I got further along in university, I realized that I was learning European languages. I studied French and Italian and German and read English literature and went to Oxford to study more of that. And the more I studied, I realized that I didn't even have proper access to all of the world and wealth of knowledge that's available in Indian languages and Indian literatures, which are very rich, very old, exist in multiple languages. And I then started to try to explore ways to engage, intellectually with India, and discovered that some of the best departments where you could study classical Indian texts and so on were actually in England or in the States or in other parts of Europe. And so right from the get-go, I had this kind of strong sense that there was something the matter there. Something had happened and gone wrong, either with educational systems in India or with our history more generally, that one had to go so far away from India in order to come back to India, in a sense. And I went to graduate school in America. I studied Sanskrit, in Chicago of all places. And then I went back to India and tried to actually work there and teach there in Indian academia. And the contradictions kind of became more and more obvious, that, we had a kind of very tiny elite and ruling class that conducted all of its life in the English language and according to a kind of standard of global lifestyles and global aspirations and very international and cosmopolitan. And then you had this huge population of over 1 billion people for whom that was not the reality, and that was not their everyday experience, and that was not their historical memory. And you also had, people of my parents and my grandparents' generation who actually remembered the point in time where India became independent from British rule, which was as recently as 1947, so only 65 years ago. They remembered sort of the leaders of the national movement and the anti-colonial movement and so on. And whenever older people spoke about India, even 30, 40, 50 years ago, it sounded like a great transformation had occurred that had only deepened some of these contradictions between you know, how much India was itself and how much it was tied to or reliant on the West.
You had heard about this in stories that your parents and others shared with you.
You know, my parents came of age in the sort of first years of Indian independence, when the Prime Minister was this figure, Jawaharlal Nehru, who was a great statesman, internationally very well known, very anglicized, you know, Anglophone, educated in England, sort of very, very British in his demeanor, that kind of a figure, but also the person who led India into its first years as a post-colonial nation state. And my parents had, you know, strong memories of actually spending their youth in Nehru's India. One always heard that things had changed, but I think after globalization, really, when the Indian market started to open up in the early 90s, which is when I was still, you know, in high school and college, it began to be sort of something that a lot of people were thinking about, right? What exactly is going on in India? The country fought so hard to free itself of British rule not 2 generations ago, and now here we are becoming aggressively kind of market-oriented and westernized in many ways again, through globalization. You know, as it became clear that, you know, my life and career was going to be in scholarship, in academia, I kind of had to explore these questions through my work, through my research.
Before this became a book,
Yeah.
clearly it's a gigantic undertaking, and it must have been daunting. How did you approach it? How did you figure out a way to manage literally thousands of years of knowledge and tradition, and then each of the individuals you wrote about is an encyclopedia?
The idea for this book literally came to me all at once in sort of the late fall of 2007, and it was very nebulous at the time. I knew that it had to be exactly at the cusp of when India was becoming modern in the broad sense that we understand modern. But I also knew that, you know, it was a very rich moment historically. It's been written about to death. Each of the founding fathers that I wanted to consider have a whole literature associated with them. I was more interested in a history of ideas than in a history of historical events, actually, that were unfolding as India was moving towards independence. So I didn't know how I would do it, but I had a strong sense that A, there was something I wanted to write about, and B, that it had to be exactly as difficult or ambitious as it was going to be, and that I could not sort of shy away from that because of my own constraints of you know, what I knew and what I could handle by way of materials.
In conducting the research, did you use mostly documents? Did you conduct interviews with descendants of the individuals you featured? How did you go about it?
So this book tells you about 5 founders of the Indian Republic and their engagement with classical texts from Indian traditions, and how those engagements produced certain ideas that became kind of central driving categories or values that allowed them to envision a new republic, away and apart from India's history of being colonized by the British. It's not the kind of history where I reveal new documents, new letters, you know, papers we had never heard of that Gandhi had written or that Tagore had sequestered away somewhere in his university, nothing like that. All the materials are known. In fact, they're probably overexposed. I did all my research in Widener Library at Harvard University, and I lived 2 minutes away from it during the writing of this book. Of course, I met a lot of people. I consulted with a lot of people. A lot of people read the manuscript. Many of them are well-known historians and scholars. Some were actually connected through their families with the national movement and so on. But really, my deepest engagement was with the texts I was reading.
Talk to us about your starting point, this concept of self-rule.
Yeah.
Explain that to us.
Well, you know, the British Crown sort of established itself as the ruler of India in 1857-58. And from the late 19th century, sort of from the 1890s onwards till the mid-1940s, a lot of Indians and a lot of Englishmen as well actually were concerned about what it meant for the British Empire to be in India and to hold India as its largest sort of possession. You know, India was the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. And Indians began talking in terms of the idea of Swaraj, which is translated usually as self-rule. And that idea actually drove more and more people to seek political independence, economic independence, and various other forms of cultural, social self-determination. And mostly when you read a history of Indian nationalism, it's all about the quest for political freedom, for political independence from British rule, right? But the idea of Swaraj or self-rule has two elements in it, right? There's a self and there's a rule, there's self and there's sovereignty. So in a sense, what I felt was that you had a history of how India became a sovereign nation state, but you didn't really have a good account of how Indians thought about, what the self is. What is India of which we are seeking Indian self-rule, right? What is this entity? What is its past? What is its future going to be like? Who can be part of it? What sorts of norms and values and ideals define it, set it apart from, just another colony that is just another part of the British Empire. And I realized that quest for the self, that search for the self, was just as important as the search for sovereignty. And of course, one had to begin with Gandhi, because he actually wrote, a kind of key work about 100 years ago in 1909 that was called Hind Swaraj, or Indian Self-Rule. And it was kind of a manifesto, and it provided the direction for the subsequent 30-40 years of anti-colonial nationalism. And so I went to that text first, and I began teaching it in my American classroom. And as I delved deeper and deeper into it, it kind of showed me a way into other writings, other texts, and other figures besides Gandhi.
Did all of that background help explain the early success of India's democracies? We're always talking about countries that are moved from one type of political system into another, and how hard it is to stand up a democracy. And you had a country that had been subjugated, as you said, for so long, and all of a sudden it was the world's largest democracy.
Yeah.
And it succeeded.
Yeah, I mean, Indian democracy is a conundrum because India had no prior history of anything that looked like a democratic form of political organization. It had been colonized, indeed, just prior to independence, for the 150 or so years before that. And when India became a nation state in 1947, and then it got a constitution in 1950, it went from 0 to 100 in the sense that we had equal citizenship, the vote for everyone, men and women, right from the get-go. It didn't happen in stages as it happened, say, in the United States or in other countries in the Western world, that you had a kind of partial achievement of the vote. First, you had only propertied classes, and you had only, you know, people of certain races, and you only had men, you didn't have women, and so on. But in India, right from the very beginning, you had men and women, rich and poor, propertied and landless. If they were, you know, Indians, they could vote. And obviously, historians, political scientists, analysts, you know, want to know why this is even happening. When you do have other kinds of social and political and economic conflict that do kind of plague the Indian polity, you know, why does this part of it work? Why does democracy seem to work? Why do you have popular leaders, self-representation, you know, electoral systems, good turnouts, you know, genuine leadership? It's a question to be asked. And so I wanted to look at the kind of backstory of that. That, you know, there must have been a climate of ideas that made this possible. You know, you don't just kind of wake up one morning and go from being colonized to being democratic, or being authoritarian to being democratic.
Now, Gandhi had a very specific perspective in life, and contrast that with the India that has evolved in the past 20 years. Would he be happy about that?
Well, you know, this is now the big debate, really, right? That you know, up to a point in the evolution of the post-colonial state, there was still a lot of momentum from the founding itself, and there was a set of directions that India was pursuing, howsoever haphazardly, right? But that there was a kind of aggressive change of direction in the early 90s with economic liberalization. And now that has already gone on for about 20 years, you know, and the Indian economy has grown a great deal and has expanded very fast in the last 10 years or so. And the numbers of the middle class are expanding, you know, dramatically, and so on. And the drama is sometimes heightened because the rest of the world is in recession, right? That's why the India-China story is so dramatic. So now that you've had 20 years of certain economic decisions being made consistently in a certain direction, that is beginning to affect the way people think, the way communities function, the way traditional values, you know, make sense or have stopped making sense in your social life. And so it's become, I think, more and more important for people to try to compare where they're at, to take stock of where they're at, you know, relative to the vision of the founders, mainly Gandhi, of course. Now, Gandhi actually in and of himself is the most interesting, because in a sense he had the most radical vision for, you know, a different kind of India. And he was not in tune with a lot of the modern world anyway. Even in his own time, he was kind of unusual in that sense. How much more so now, you know, 60 or 70 years later. You know, Gandhi was all about being frugal and being environmentally conscious and being, you know, against consumerism and consumption, about living within your means, about nonviolence. You know, a set of principles that sound more and more outlandish, but are also sort of paradoxically more and more necessary in today's world. So I think there is a big return to Gandhi. I mean, it's not just my book. You know, you'll see a whole slew of books just in the last 2 to 3 years, the next 2 to 3 years, that all go back to Gandhi, because everyone senses that, you know, many things he was saying 100 years ago were prescient. You know, he predicted certain kinds of conflict, certain kinds of ecological calamities, certain kinds of social breakdown, which are indeed coming true or threatening to come true. And so you want to check back with him and see, you know, what did we do wrong? Can we self-correct?
In writing this book, what was the one item you came across that most impressed you or surprised you or inspired you?
The fifth figure in my 5 founders is Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who was sort of leader of the Indian untouchables, the lowest of the low in the Hindu caste system. He was also a great jurist, a great political mind, and was actually the person overseeing the drafting of the Indian Constitution. So, you know, a great modernist, an egalitarian thinker who is important not just for India but for the world, I think. And in a way, his story actually for me was the most difficult to understand and to integrate into the narrative that I was trying to construct. Because he was, you know, as somebody who belonged to a class of people most disadvantaged and most oppressed throughout Indian history, he had certain stakes in the modernization of India, which were quite different from those of other leaders who came from more privileged sections of society. You know, our relationship with tradition, with conserving the past, you know, our ability to be socially conservative and so on, is a direct correlative of where we stand in the social system. And for Ambedkar, who came from, you know, the most kind of victimized section of Indian society, Western values and certain kind of political modernity held out the greatest promise for emancipation from, you know, a deep past of great inequality and great injustice, right? Now he, towards the end of his life, converted to Buddhism and kind of made a strange return to one of the most ancient religions that is available on the Indian subcontinent. And that is a real problem. You know, intellectually it's a problem in that you're trying to understand what made him go back to the past. Why did he make this gesture of turning once again to religion when he had rejected religion and, you know, the caste system of Hindu society, which is part and parcel of Hindu religious systems. He had rejected that outright. He had helped to craft the Constitution, which is a modern liberal republic forming founding document. Why then did he 10 years later turn back to the idea of you know, Buddhism as a possible way forward, especially for the lowest of the low in Indian society? That was the biggest conundrum that I felt I had to kind of try to address and deal with and write about. And it took me the longest time. That was the last chapter I wrote. I was writing it literally to the very last minute. And it made me realize that you know, this is not a problem I could solve in the scope of this book. And so I've actually decided to write my next book as a biography of Ambedkar, because I need to stay with him much more than I was able to in the scope of this book.
Well, thank you for sharing with us today and for joining us, Ananya Vajpeyi.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, John.
And thank you. For Global Perspectives, I'm John Bercia. We'll see you next time.
This program is made possible, in part, by funding from the UCF Global Perspectives Office, the Global Connections Foundation, and the India Center at UCF.